Pinewood was a town that could easily be overlooked, nestled between rolling hills and thick woods, its modest homes lined up along winding dirt roads. There was little to distinguish Pinewood from any other small rural town, except for one thing: the church. Every Sunday, the roads that once seemed quiet became flooded with cars, people traveling from distant places, believing that the Divine Light Ministry could offer them something they could not find elsewhere. The moment they crossed the threshold of that church, they were entering a world of miracles, a world where even the most impossible things seemed to bend to Pastor Samuel's will. Pinewood may have been small, but to the people who came to Pastor Samuel Grant's church, it was the center of the universe. It was here that hope was found, where sickness was cured, and where the broken could be made whole. From the outside, it seemed like a blessing, an oasis of divine grace. But behind the walls of the church, things were not as they seemed. A man of considerable presence. He was not just a preacher, he was a spectacle, a man of charisma with an almost magnetic pull. His voice, smooth as velvet, filled the hearts of his followers with a strange, irresistible longing. Pastor Samuel had built his reputation as a miracle worker, a healer, a divine messenger, a man who could change the course of someone's life in an instant. The blind saw, the crippled walked, wealth poured in. For every prayer, a miracle followed. It was a pattern so consistent, so powerful, it left little room for doubt. He was the man people came to for answers, for redemption, for miracles. Pastor Samuel Grant was a figurehead of faith, a man whose every word was treated as gospel. His presence alone could make the impossible seem trivial, the miraculous ordinary. He had built his church into something more than just a place of worship. It was the heartbeat of Pinewood, a place where faith was not just practiced but expected. But for all his charm, for all his devotion to his followers, was there a darker force that kept his ministry growing? Pastor Samuel's son. Ethan had always known the power his father wielded, even as a child. The adoring looks from congregants, the respect, the reverence. It was a life few could ever imagine, but there was something else about Ethan's life, something that weighed on him as he grew older. He wasn't blind to the cracks that appeared in the perfect image his father and mother had created. The late-night meetings, the strange behavior, the rumors that circled around the church. His father had said, as Ethan got older, he began to notice things that others ignored. The miracles seemed almost too perfect. Or was there something far more disturbing behind them? Ethan Grant was raised in the shadow of greatness, the son of the man who performed miracles. But for all the admiration he received, there was a different side to his life. It was a life that was quiet, observant, and growing increasingly uncomfortable. As the town celebrated his father's rise to prominence, Ethan began to see the darker side of the church, the unsettling whispers that crept through the walls, and the strange rituals his father insisted on keeping secret. Grace and poise were Rachel's trademarks. As Pastor Samuel's wife, she was the epitome of what a pastor's spouse should be: gentle, caring, always willing to help others. To the outside world, Rachel was perfect. Her smile never faltered, her presence radiated calm, and her devotion to her husband and church was unquestionable. But behind closed doors, Rachel often struggled with exhaustion. The constant demands of the church wore her down, and the secret knowledge she held, things she didn't share even with her son, haunted her. She had seen things, witnessed things, that made her doubt everything she had once believed about her husband. Rachel Grant was the perfect pastor's wife. She had to be. Her life, like her husband's, was an image carefully crafted for the world to see. She sang in the choir, assisted with the services, and helped manage the church's activities. She made sure everything ran smoothly, always with a smile on her face. But that smile often hid a woman worn thin by the weight of secrets, by the growing suspicion that the life she'd built was not as holy as it appeared. She, too, had witnessed things she could not explain, things that made her question her husband's so-called miracles. Riverside, a town where miracles bloomed like wildflowers, was not what it seemed. Beneath the surface of the Divine Light Ministry, things were changing. And Ethan Grant was beginning to see the darkness that lurked within the shadows of his father's ministry, a darkness that would soon begin to unravel the very foundation of his family. Every Sunday, as the congregation gathered in the grand yet humble church of Pinewood, They would hear stories that seemed to defy logic. People came from miles away, all with one thing in common: a desperate hope. They sought Pastor Samuel Grant, the man who had built his reputation not just as a preacher, but as a miracle worker, a healer capable of making the impossible real. There was Mrs. Lillian Carter, who had been blind for over a decade. Her life was a world of darkness until one fateful service, when Pastor Samuel laid his hands upon her. The moment his fingers touched her forehead, it was as if a veil lifted. Lillian's eyes, once clouded with blindness, opened, and she saw the world around her for the first time in years. She wept, her heart overwhelmed with gratitude, and the church erupted in joyous applause. The miracle was real, or so it seemed, and it wasn't just Lillian. There were countless others, those who had battled cancer, financial ruin, and broken relationships, all healed or restored by the powerful presence of Pastor Samuel. Each one of these stories only added to the growing legend of the Divine Light Ministry. There was Thomas's childhood friend Ben, who had suffered from crippling arthritis for most of his life. Ben's hands, once gnarled and twisted with pain, suddenly regained their strength after a single prayer from Pastor Samuel. Ben wept in disbelief, his body no longer bound by the chains of illness. The congregation cheered and praised while Thomas watched from the sidelines, his heart caught between awe and something darker. How was it possible? How could these miracles be so consistent, so flawless, time after time? But what truly captivated the members of the church, what drew them in like moths to a flame, were the stories of financial restoration. There was Mr. Kenneth Fields, an old, broken man who had lived through years of poverty. He had nothing left to give. His debts were piling up, his hope drained away with each passing day. But one Sunday, as he kneeled before Pastor Samuel, a miracle happened. Kenneth received a check in the mail the very next day, an inheritance from a long-lost relative he had never met. The amount was enough to clear his debts, buy him a new home, and ensure a life free from the burdens of financial struggle. It was these stories that seemed to transcend the natural world, that made Thomas's heart swell with pride for his father. His father was not only a spiritual leader, he was a savior to the people of Pinewood. He was a man who brought hope where there was none, light in a world of darkness. To the outside world, Pastor Samuel's ministry was an unbroken chain of miracles, proof of divine intervention. But to Thomas, it was starting to feel more like a spectacle, a performance staged to inspire awe and devotion. And as he watched his father perform these miracles, his heart began to question, was it truly divine? Or was there something more at play? It wasn't long before Thomas's admiration began to shift into suspicion. The miracles were undeniable, but as he watched his father closer, something began to feel off. Late at night, when the rest of the town had gone to bed, Thomas would often hear strange sounds coming from his father's study. Whispers, hurried footsteps, the creak of the door. His father, the great healer, would sometimes disappear into that study, locking the door behind him. Thomas, ever curious, would sneak down the hallway, pressing his ear to the wood, trying to listen to what was going on behind those closed doors. All he could hear were muffled conversations, voices hurried and urgent. There were times when he would hear chants in languages he didn't understand, words that seemed to hold power, a power that made his skin crawl. And then there were the things he found hidden in his father's study, strange artifacts, small, carefully wrapped bundles that, when unwrapped, revealed bones that did not look human, feathers black as midnight, stones etched with strange symbols that gave him a sense of unease. One evening, when Pastor Samuel had forgotten to lock the door, Thomas couldn't resist. He snuck into the study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. He opened the chest where his father kept these objects. What he saw made his blood run cold. Artifacts that seemed to belong to something ancient, something not of this world. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. When his father discovered him snooping around, the explanation came quickly. "These are relics from my mission work," Pastor Samuel said, his voice steady, his face unreadable. "Things to remind me of the forces we fight against in this world. These are the tools of evil we must eradicate, tools of false prophets. But you must never speak of this, Thomas." But Thomas wasn't convinced. The way his father's hand trembled as he locked the chest again, the flash of fear in his eyes, it didn't sit right. Pastor Samuel, the man who had always seemed so confident, so composed, was hiding something dark. As if that wasn't enough, rumors began to spread throughout Pinewood. Rumors that the miracles weren't all they seemed. Some whispered that in order to receive divine healing, one had to make a personal sacrifice, that the price for miracles was not only a financial one but also a spiritual one. The tales were disturbing, people speaking in hushed tones about deals made behind closed doors, about promises made in the dark of night, about things that couldn't be undone. But Thomas didn't know what to believe. His father had always done good, had always helped people. Could the miracles really come at such a cost? Was there something hidden beneath the surface, something sinister that he couldn't yet understand? Thomas found himself torn. He had watched as his father changed lives, brought hope, and performed wonders. He had witnessed the joy of those who had been healed, those who had received miracles that restored them, both physically and spiritually. But the doubts lingered. Something wasn't right. How could such power exist without consequence? And what was his father's role in it? Was he truly the divine vessel he portrayed himself to be, or was he just another man caught up in something far darker? As Thomas wrestled with his doubts, he became more aware of his father's transformation. Pastor Samuel had once been humble, quiet, reserved, but as the miracles grew, so did his sense of entitlement, his aura of control. The more power he seemed to have over the lives of his followers, the more distant he became from the family he had once cared for. His obsession with the miracles deepened, and the lines between good and evil seemed to blur. Miracles come with a price, Thomas thought to himself, the words echoing in his mind. But what was that price? And was it too high to pay? As he continued to watch from the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that the miracles his father performed weren't just a blessing. They were part of something much larger, something much darker, that would eventually claim them all. As Thomas grew older, the once sacred, almost comforting rituals of the Divine Light ministry began to feel like something else entirely. What had once been a place of faith and hope began to transform into a sinister theater, where behind every miracle, something darker seemed to lurk in the shadows. Through Thomas's eyes, the truth began to take shape, slowly at first, like a creeping fog that you could almost ignore, but eventually, the fog became an inescapable storm. In the solitude of his father's study, Thomas began uncovering things he was never meant to see. Strange items, bones, feathers, and symbols etched onto stones lay hidden in a locked chest. When he dared to open it, he found a collection of artifacts that seemed to speak of something ancient, something forbidden. The bones were twisted, not of human origin. The feathers were jet black, their texture unnaturally smooth, as though they had been preserved for a purpose unknown to him. And the stones, each one inscribed with symbols that caused his eyes to burn just looking at them, carried an energy that was inexplicable, unsettling. They were not religious relics as his father had claimed. No, these were remnants of something far darker. The air in the study was always heavy, as if the walls themselves held secrets that no one should ever uncover. Thomas had heard the whispers. His father's hurried conversations with strangers who came at night, using the back door, never the front. Their voices low and urgent, too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, dread, and a kind of desperation that Thomas had never heard before from his father. The animals knew it too. It wasn't just the eerie stillness that would fall over the neighborhood when Pastor Samuel passed by. It was the way the dogs would suddenly fall silent, the way the birds would abandon their songs. The stray cats that usually gathered near the Anderson home would scatter in terror whenever his father stepped outside. Even the horses in the nearby fields would grow agitated, tossing their heads as if they sensed a presence that made them uneasy. There was something about Pastor Samuel that unnerved the natural world around him. It was as if the very earth itself had begun to recoil in fear. But it wasn't just the animals. Strange occurrences began to multiply, moments that felt too unnatural to explain. There were times when the lights in the church would flicker, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. And the sounds, low chants, whispers in languages that no one could recognize. The members of the congregation were oblivious to it all, their eyes focused on the miracles, their faith unwavering. But Thomas could not ignore what was happening around him. He could hear the chanting coming from his father's study late at night, see the flicker of strange lights that emanated from beneath the door. When he tried to peek inside, he found his father standing at the center of a circle drawn on the floor, the air thick with tension, as if he were performing. The miracles had always seemed so real. How could anyone doubt them? The healings, the money falling from the rafters, the transformation of the most broken souls into something whole. It was impossible not to be swept up in the power of it all. Yet, as Thomas's doubts grew, he began to realize that the miracles came with a price. The price, however, was never made clear. One night, as Thomas lay awake in his room, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard voices, his mother and father speaking in low tones, their words too urgent to ignore. He crept to the hallway and pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear. What he overheard shook him to his core. "We've gone too far, Samuel," his mother's voice trembled, filled with a kind of quiet panic. "How much more? How much longer will this last? I'm scared of what's happening. I'm scared of you." Pastor Samuel's voice was firm, unwavering. "We need more power, Grace. It's the only way. The miracles are just the beginning, but we need to do more. We need to reach the next level. It's the only way to save the ministry, to save us." There was a long pause before Grace's voice broke through again. "But at what cost? What are we becoming?" Thomas could hear the fear in his mother's voice, and it was that fear that began to gnaw at him. What were they becoming? What had his father done to gain this power? Was it truly divine, or had he made a deal with something far more dangerous, something that sought to consume them all? And then there was the moment, the single moment that Thomas would never forget. It was during a Sunday service, just like any other. The church was packed with worshipers, the air thick with anticipation. Pastor Samuel stood at the pulpit, his white suit gleaming under the harsh lights, a man possessed by the very presence of God. He began to pray, his voice thundering through the church, and the congregation followed in rapturous devotion. But as he spoke, something happened. The shadows around him began to shift, to warp. His own shadow, cast on the wall behind him, grew distorted. It stretched, lengthened, and began to take on a monstrous shape. Horns appeared where there had been none. Branches twisted out from the top of his head, creating a grotesque silhouette that seemed to tower over the congregation. Thomas watched in horror, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no divine miracle. This was something else entirely. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. His father's eyes, once warm and loving, seemed to change in that moment. They grew dark, blacker than anything he had ever seen. Empty voids that seemed to pull at his very soul. The congregation, lost in their trance, didn't see it. They didn't see the unnatural distortion of the man they trusted, the man they revered. They only saw the miracles, the healing, the divine touch that made everything seem possible. But Thomas could see the truth that was hidden in plain sight. Thomas's doubts were no longer just whispers in his mind. They had become a screaming reality that he couldn't ignore. The miracles were real, but were they divine? Or was something darker pulling the strings? Something ancient and malevolent, using his father as a vessel. The more he learned, the more terrified he became. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place where dark rituals were carried out, where the price of miracles was paid with something far more valuable than money. It was a price that no one spoke of, but that everyone had to pay. Was Pastor Samuel aware of what he had become? Or had he, too, fallen victim to the darkness that had taken root in the very foundation of the ministry? And if the miracles were not divine, then what was he willing to do to continue the charade, to maintain the power that had made him the most revered man in Pinewood? The more Thomas uncovered, the more he realized that the true cost of miracles was not just the sacrifices made by the congregation. It was the price his father had already paid, and it was a price that, soon, they would all be forced to pay. It was a night like any other, quiet, still, with only the sound of the wind rustling leaves outside the Anderson home. But for Thomas, it was a night that would forever change the course of his life. He had heard enough whispers, seen enough strange occurrences, that something within him couldn't rest. The The doubt that had festered for years now clawed at him with an urgency he could no longer ignore. The answers lay in his father's study, the same study where the strange artifacts were kept hidden away, the place where the rituals had been performed, and where the true nature of the ministry had been concealed from the world. Thomas waited until the house was asleep. His mother, exhausted from another week of church services, was already in bed. The sound of his father's voice was distant, as if he were lost in thought, speaking to someone unseen in the confines of the study. This was Thomas's chance. He moved swiftly, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He slipped through the narrow hallway and into the study, the familiar scent of old books and incense filling the air. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single candle flickering on the desk. There, in the corner of the room, was the chest, the one that had haunted his thoughts for so long. The chest that his father had always locked, the chest that was never to be touched. With trembling hands, Thomas unlocked the chest. He couldn't have prepared himself for what he found inside. The contents of the chest were unlike anything he had ever seen. Bones twisted, deformed, and carefully arranged. Feathers, jet black, glistening in the candlelight as though they had never seen the light of day. Strange stones etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. And there, among the bizarre collection, was a book. Ancient, its pages worn and yellowed with age. It was written in a language Thomas didn't recognize, its words seeming to shimmer and dance on the page. This wasn't just a collection of strange objects. It was a catalog of forbidden knowledge, a guide to rituals that defied the laws of nature. Thomas's mind raced. His father, the man he had looked up to, the man who had healed the sick and performed the impossible, had been hiding this from him. Pastor James, the beloved leader of Riverside's Divine Light Ministry, wasn't the divine healer everyone thought he was. No, he was a man who had made a pact with forces far beyond human understanding, forces that demanded a price for every miracle, a price that would now cost Thomas more than he could possibly imagine. Just as Thomas began to process the magnitude of his discovery, he heard the door creak open behind him. He froze, panic flooding his veins. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with his father's. Pastor James stood in the doorway, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed a hint of something darker, something that made Thomas's blood run cold. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" his father asked, his voice unnervingly calm. For a moment, there was silence, the weight of the discovery hanging heavily in the air. Thomas tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His father, once the source of all his admiration, was no longer the man he had believed him to be. He was a man who had trafficked in dark powers, using forbidden rituals to achieve the miracles that had made him famous. "You're not the man I thought you were," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You've been lying to all of us. The miracles, they aren't real, are they? You've been using something else, something dark." Pastor James didn't flinch. Instead, he walked toward the chest and knelt beside it, his fingers gently brushing over the strange artifacts as though he were caressing old friends. "The miracles are real, Thomas," he said, his voice steady, almost soothing. "But you're right, they don't come without a price. This is the only way to keep the miracles flowing. God works in mysterious ways, but sometimes we must make a deal." A chill ran through Thomas's body. His father wasn't speaking of faith, of divine grace. He was speaking of something far more terrifying. This wasn't the voice of a man who had been touched by the Holy Spirit. This was the voice of someone who had made a bargain with forces that were beyond human comprehension. "Do you understand, Thomas?" Pastor James continued, his eyes locking with his son's. "Do you understand what it takes to bring about the kind of miracles people expect? What it takes to keep the church growing, to keep the people believing? There's power in these rituals, in these artifacts, and that power doesn't come from prayer alone." The words sank deep into Thomas's soul, poisoning his once strong belief in his father. The man who had raised him, the man who had shown him faith and love, was now revealing himself as a man who had crossed a line from which there would be no return. "You're not doing this for God," Thomas said, the realization dawning on him with crushing clarity. "You're doing this for power. You've sold yourself to something else, something evil." Pastor James's expression faltered for just a moment, but then his calm demeanor returned. He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving Thomas's face. "Power, yes, but not for me, for the ministry, for all of us. This is what has been required of me to ensure the miracles continue. This is the only way I can save us, Thomas. You have to understand, I've given everything for this. My soul, my life, all of it. And I will keep doing it for as long as I have to, because the people need to believe. They need to see the miracles. They need to feel that they are safe." Thomas felt the weight of his father's words, but they only made his heart sink deeper. His father was beyond saving, lost to the darkness he had embraced. The miracles, the healings, the money falling from the rafters. It had all come at a cost, and that cost was more than anyone could have ever imagined. As the realization hit him, Thomas understood that the price of miracles was not just paid by those who received them, it was paid by the very soul of his father. Pastor James wasn't the divine healer he had once believed him to be. He was a man caught in a web of darkness, a man who had made a deal that would haunt them both forever. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Pastor James looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Now, Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with finality, "you choose. You can walk away, forget everything you've seen and continue on with your life, or you can stay and help me keep this power alive." Thomas felt his world crumble around him. His father wasn't just a preacher, a miracle worker. He was a man who had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The decision was no longer about belief or faith, it was about survival. Would he stay and risk losing himself to the same darkness that had consumed his father? Or would he leave, knowing that the truth would haunt him forever? In that moment, Thomas realized something he would never forget. The world of miracles was not one of light, it was a world of shadows, and the price of those miracles was far greater than anyone had ever imagined. The truth had come crashing down like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of Riverside's Divine Light ministry. Thomas had tried to warn them, tried to make the people see what was happening behind the scenes, but the power of belief was a force stronger than anyone had anticipated, and no matter how hard he fought, no one wanted to hear the truth. The miracles had cast a spell over the congregation, a spell so powerful that it blinded them to the dark forces at play. They saw only what they wanted to see. The healings, the visions, the divine intervention. They couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge the dark price that had been paid. On that fateful Sunday morning, the final confrontation came. The air in the church was thick with anticipation, as it always was during the service. The music played softly in the background, the congregation swaying in their seats, eyes closed, hands raised in worship. The atmosphere was electric. There was a sense that something miraculous was about to happen. And in many ways it was, but it wasn't the miracle that people were expecting. Thomas stood at the back of the church, his heart racing as he watched his father, Pastor James, take the pulpit. The man who had once been his hero was now a stranger. The miracles had changed him, twisted him. And now Thomas was ready to reveal the truth to everyone. It was time to shatter the illusion, to expose the lies. He wasn't going to stand by any longer. As Pastor James began to speak, his voice soothing and charismatic, Thomas couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped forward, the murmurs of the congregation dying down as he moved toward the pulpit. He reached it, his hands gripping the edge as he looked into his father's eyes. There was no turning back now. "Father, you've lied to them!" Thomas's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. The congregation fell silent, shocked by the sudden interruption. "All of this, it's not real. The miracles, the healings, the power you claim to have, they come at a price you've paid with something far darker than any of us could have imagined." The room was heavy with tension as eyes turned from Thomas to Pastor James. The atmosphere had shifted. What had once been a place of worship now felt like a courtroom, the weight of truth hanging in the air. Pastor James's face darkened. He hadn't expected this. The calm, collected leader, the man who had built his empire on the faith of others, now stood at a crossroads. His world, built on lies, was crumbling around him. He could feel the eyes of the congregation on him, some filled with confusion, others with anger. but there was no escape now. "Thomas?" Pastor James said, his voice low but controlled. "You don't understand. What I've done, what we've all done, is for a greater good. The miracles, the power, it's what they need. It's what the people need." "No," Thomas shot back, his voice growing stronger. "You've used them, used their faith to feed your own power. You've deceived them, all of them." The tension in the room was palpable, as the truth, ugly and undeniable, began to sink in. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some even beginning to whisper amongst themselves. What Thomas had feared for so long was finally happening. The cracks were beginning to show. The belief that had once bound them all together was now shattered, and with it, the facade of the miracles. Some began to rise from their seats, murmuring in disbelief, their faces filled with shock and confusion. A few turned and walked out, unable to reconcile the man they had followed with the monster that Thomas was revealing. Others remained, frozen in place, caught in the grip of disbelief. Pastor James, now fully aware of the collapse happening around him, fought to regain control. "You can't do this, Thomas," he said, his voice edged with panic. "You don't know what you're saying. This ministry, this church, it's everything. I've given my life to this. You've ruined everything." "I'm trying to save you," Thomas replied, his voice steady now, the weight of the truth settling in. "But you're too far gone, and now you've destroyed the one thing that could have saved us, the trust of the people." In that moment, something inside Thomas broke. He wasn't just confronting his father. He was confronting everything that had been built on lies, on manipulation, and on deceit. The miracles, the healings, the faith, it had all been a carefully crafted illusion, and now it was falling apart. As the dust settled and the church began to unravel, Thomas realized that there would be no going back. The damage had been done, the secrets had been exposed, and the people of Riverside would never be able to look at their church the same way again. Faith, once a source of comfort, hope, and healing, had been twisted into something dark and sinister. The line between good and evil had blurred so completely that even the most devout believers couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And in the end, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because when people's faith is used against them, when it is manipulated for power, it doesn't just shatter, it leaves behind a void that's nearly impossible to fill. The fallout from that day would reverberate for years to come. Riverside would never be the same. And neither would Thomas. He had lost his father, his belief in the divine, and his place in the world he had once known. But what he had gained, what he had learned, was far more valuable. The truth had been exposed. The darkness had been brought to light. That's how a war watching this, you'll never look at your church the same way again. Faith is a powerful thing. It can lift you up, it can heal you, it can give you hope in your darkest hours. But it can also be twisted, used for control, and manipulated for power. Always question, always seek the truth, because sometimes the greatest miracle is the truth itself. As the story of Riverside's Divine Light ministry comes to a close, the consequences of blind faith and the pursuit of power are impossible to ignore. The truth, no matter how painful, has finally been exposed. But what happened in Riverside is not unique. Across the world, countless stories of manipulation, deception, and exploitation are unfolding within the very walls meant to offer salvation and peace. This is just the beginning of the deeper and darker truths that often lie hidden beneath the surface. If you found this story eye-opening, shocking, or unsettling, don't forget to give this video a like. Your support helps uncover these hidden truths, and your engagement fuels the journey of bringing more untold stories to light. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear about the dangers lurking in places that should be filled with faith, not fear. And if this story captivated you, stick with us. There's much more to come. In our next video, we'll dive even deeper into the world of faith and power, revealing more secrets and stories that you won't believe until you see them for yourself. Trust me, you don't want to miss what we have in store. Remember, questioning the truth is the first step to finding it. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and always seek the real story behind the headlines.